This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to do a talk which I call the War in Philadelphia. It was a war that took place between the Federalists and the Republicans and left a lot of carcasses in its wake. But what I want to talk about has a preamble, because how did we get to Philadelphia? Our first capital, of course, was in New York City. George Washington was inaugurated in New York City on April the 30th, 1789. Congress was already meeting there, and they had for a while. They were all in Federal Hall, which was right on Wall Street in New York City. And Federal Hall had a larger lower floor and a smaller upper floor. So the Congress went on the first floor, and the Senate, which was smaller, went on the second, which immediately led to a saying, the upper house and the lower house, which would be continued in Philadelphia, but changed totally once we get to Washington, D.C. Now, everyone was quite content with New York City. It was a very, very well and strategic area, had a great seaport, and it was quite well suited. However, Thomas Jefferson hated it. And there was an issue that took place that would change where our government would be. There was a meeting that took place between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Now, Thomas Jefferson wanted the capital in the South. Alexander Hamilton wanted a bank and a money system. At that point, we were using a lot of Spanish pieces of eights, which, of course, our money system would be based on eventually. And so in the course of this meeting, Jefferson basically said, Mr. Hamilton, you want your money system and your bank? And, of course, he said yes. And he said, and I want my government in the South. There wasn't much Hamilton can do, and he agreed to the deal. So they figured that in the area of Virginia, somewhere right in there, they would create their new capital. But that took time. And so the interim government would be in Philadelphia. And so in 1790, everything was moved to Philadelphia. And George Washington was president, of course. But in Philadelphia, it was one of the great centers of publishing, books and newspapers, and there was a great deal of organizations involved in political theory and thought. And so, Washington would follow his affairs, and many of the people in Philadelphia started to change, because there was a break in the system. You know, the Constitution had been written without the idea of political parties. But within George Washington's cabinet, which included a Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who was called back from France. You see, Thomas Jefferson was very much involved with the French. And he was very, very interested in the idea of the French having a revolution to unseat the king. And he was pushing for many of these things. Many important documents were written within his own home dealing with the French. And he was dragged back from France and brought to join George Washington's administration. Now, Jefferson was not a fan of Washington, and he truly hated Hamilton. They had different opinions. And so within George Washington's cabinet, a fissure started. And while you had the Federalists, who were Washington, Hamilton, and Adams, a new group came out called the Republicans. And who was the leader of the Republicans? Thomas Jefferson. And of course his sidekick was James Madison. And collectively, Jefferson and Madison started a campaign through newspapers anonymously to totally disrupt the administration of George Washington. A lot of this had to do with France, because George Washington announced immediately that the United States would hold itself back and be neutral in situations like the French Revolution. Of course, it was said that we had a treaty with France. And of course, Hamilton mentioned to Jefferson and through Washington that treaty, that alliance, was with the King of France, King Louis XVI. And then by 1793, it was said that treaty died with the king. And so the attacks upon the Washington administration increased to a rather violent form, that there eventually were marches and bonfires all around the presidential mansion. And the people were screaming about Washington, how he was a traitor, and they said he should be treated like a traitor. Terrified Washington. Washington was so used to being adored and told how wonderful he was, and here were crowds telling him that he should be strung up on a tree. These were dangerous moments, but it was just the beginning. There were many various organs throughout the city, publishing organs that made newspapers. Many were pro-Republican. Many would receive assistance from people involved with Jefferson, and in some cases from Jefferson himself. Jefferson would eventually hire an individual by the name of Mr. Callender, and Mr. Callender's job was specifically to destroy Federalists. Things got far worse as we reached the point of 1796, when George Washington announces he is not going to run for a third term. Who runs for office at that point? Adams as a Federalist and Jefferson as a Republican. Now, leading up to this whole point had been many battles with Washington and with Jefferson and with Hamilton and Jefferson, finally leading to Jefferson leaving the Washington administration and totally going fully out to destroy any kind of Federalist activity. Now, of course, his name was never used. James Madison's name was never used. But Washington was no fool. He knew who was doing it. And he basically told Jefferson, I know what you're doing. That didn't stop Jefferson. Jefferson started a campaign, actually, against Washington, stating that he was feeble, that he was senile, that he was losing it. He said he had arms like an old athlete, very flabby, and he had a name for Washington. He called him Old Muttonhead. Certainly not worthy of any trouble, but that's what he called him. But this whole smear campaign against Washington really pissed off Washington. So much so, he told his wife, don't ever let that man on my property, and conversation between Washington and Jefferson ceases. 1796 is a very, very important time because John Adams wins the election by 3 votes. Many people will go out of their way to tell Adams that he won by just 3 votes. Now, of course, there was a massive smear campaign against Adams in 1796, and there were attacks all over the place in Philadelphia. Now, here's the other thing that's quite fascinating. on his own side, Alexander Hamilton, who was brilliant at one minute and absolutely insane the next, he wrote a pamphlet all about the insanity of John Adams. Why? Because he didn't like him. And what was the reason why he didn't like him? Because John Adams would not follow Hamilton's desires. You see, George Washington was pretty easygoing. He trusted Hamilton, and when Hamilton told him to do something, Washington kind of agreed to it. That was the relationship. And Hamilton was not faring as well with Adams, so he was unhappy about it. Hence, this publication came out. The Republicans found it and published it, which totally destroyed the reputation of Alexander Hamilton and totally cut off any endearment that Adams and many of his Federalist friends had for Hamilton. At this point, things really start to explode because there's the revolution which has been going on. You have government de jure in France. And the thing is that there's constant battles and murders and killing. And you think about the guillotines. There was just rivers of blood going down the road in France. Adams makes sure that we have nothing to do with that situation. And as the years go on, we find ourselves going into a undeclared war with France, which was basically sea battles. At this point, Alexander Hamilton tells George Washington to become commander of the military to fight against France. Now, listen to this. Hamilton tells Washington, and Washington tells Adams he's doing this. They're not listening to the president. They're telling the president what they're doing. Now, this whole thing was, by 1799, George Washington was not the George Washington that he once was. He was kind of feeble, and he even wrote that he finds himself lessening in his mental powers. So Hamilton tells him to be general-in-chief, and the whole idea is Washington will be general-in-chief, he will retire, and who will become general-in-chief? Alexander Hamilton. That's what he wanted. He wanted that uniform. He wanted to be the general. He loved that kind of pomp and circumstance. Adams had no interest in having Hamilton as a general. And so he makes sure that there is no declared war. Now, in Philadelphia, at this point, you have gangs and groups beating other people up. Federalists are beating up Republicans. Republicans are beating up Federalists. You have murders on the street. You have gang violence. The newspapers are publishing absolute false information about Adams. Callender is working overtime. You got to remember, Thomas Jefferson's paying Callender. And by the way, an interesting thing about 1796, which would be changed in the Constitution, whoever got the most votes was president. Whoever got the next amount of votes was vice president. Very, very dangerous thing to do. And with Jefferson, you had the greatest rat in the government, because Jefferson had no intention of allowing the Adams administration to succeed in much of anything. He also was very pro-French, and he would always go to the French and tell them what Adams was doing. Now, there's another side to this, and it was partly the fault of Adams. To honor his predecessor, he kept the cabinet that Washington had. That was a great mistake, because that cabinet was completely under the control of Hamilton. They didn't listen to Adams. And so Adams had a hostile cabinet, which he would eventually fire, but far too late. And he had a hostile vice president that was basically giving information to the enemy. There were riots, there were murders, there were bonfires in front of the presidential mansion saying that Adams should be strung up. Pure and total anarchy in Philadelphia. And so the Federalists, who were basically in charge at the time, write up the papers. They were called the Alien and Sedition Act because there were so many people from France coming in and trying to raise trouble and trying to make us fight a war. Unfortunately, Adams approves it. Now, here's the thing. Adams always checked with his wife to make sure everything was okay. And he said, Abigail, what do you think of this? She looked at it and said, looks fine to me. Mistake on her part, but probably not truly. Because this was a public relations nightmare. Because Jefferson goes to all the papers and tells them, destroy Adams. And they obey. Jefferson was the greatest danger to this country that you can imagine. I mean, Hamilton was a bit of a danger too, because he was nuts half the time. But Thomas Jefferson went against the president, went against his country, and did things that challenged the very nature of the safety of the Republic of the United States. I wish they had impeached him. I wish somebody had had the nerve to try. Because of all of the presidents, I don't think any president has been under the pressure that John Adams was. A hostile cabinet, a vice president working with the enemy, and the press totally giving a lot of propaganda. So the Alien and Sedition Acts are put out. They're immediately made to embarrass Adams. And to this day, it's what we hear about, how bad they were. But you have to understand the climate in which they were put out. Eventually, we come to 1800. And you know, the great thing is that Adams didn't have time to campaign. The newspapers are destroying him. But he won't go to war. He works on creating a peaceful settlement to the situation and opening up a friendly dialogue with France. This is very important and not talked about too much. Adams loses, of course. And of course, what happens is through that happy exchange that they have created with France, eventually will come whispers of something called the Louisiana Purchase. This is so vitally important. And through those battles in France, we finally came to an era of peace and a great expansion to the United States in the Jefferson administration. Much thanks to the hard work of John Adams, who received no credit whatsoever.